So in a sense, exponential death is the opposite of exponential growth. So with exponential growth, what you have are increases in the amount of something, where the increase per unit time, in absolute terms, is a function of how much is present at the start of that increase. So you're going up in increments. Each step, the rate at which you're increasing, in fact, is a function of how much of the thing is already present. And in fact, I'm indicating this as though it were a straight line, and we'll get to why it's a straight line, but in absolute terms, in a nice linear graph, you would see something instead that looks like this, and that's a J-shaped curve. And I'll put the J-shaped curve over there if I can find chalk. So this is biology, so very often what you'll see on the dependent axis, the x-axis is time, and we're talking explicitly about reducing numbers of organisms. So on the y-axis, the dependent axis, so independent axis, dependent axis, if I stated that incorrectly just a moment ago, you've got the number of organisms and you've got time. And if you're having exponential growth, then you have something that looks like this. So the nature of this curve is that with time, the curve becomes steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper. And that's what it is meant, that's what it means to say that the rate of increase, which is the slope of the curve, in a sense, acceleration, is a function of how many individuals are already present. So that's exponential growth. In exponential death, you have essentially the same thing. And the curve looks like this, more or less. Okay, it becomes asymptotic towards zero. So it gets closer and closer and closer to zero, but never quite gets there. Now, that's a bit of a lie, because if you're working with something that is discrete, so individual units, such as individual bacteria, in fact, you can pretty much get to zero. And you do so by essentially overkilling the population. So if you set things up so that you've killed the population a millionfold past one individual, you've probably wiped out all of the individuals in the population. Admittedly, that's probabilistic. There's still some chance that some individual will be present. What you're trying to do basically is to get things as close to zero as possible, and indeed to get things below 1, as far below 1 as you can get away with. So you're never really, in absolute terms, going to get to zero, but when you're working with discrete entities like individual bacteria, you can be pretty sure that you have, with reasonably high probability, gotten rid of all of the bacteria, at least the ones that are easily reached and affected, highly affected by whatever you're treating them with. You can be pretty sure you've gotten essentially the treated population down to zero. So that's an exponential decline. Now, with exponential growth, typically we'll use this in units of 2, increases of 2, because in that way you can talk about the doubling time of organisms. A bacterium goes from 1 bacterium to 2 bacteria to 4 bacteria to 8 bacteria. Not everything increases by 2s. If you have a litter of 10 and everything survives, then you go from 1 to 10 to 100. Of course, even that's more complicated than that. If you have males and females, and it takes 2 individuals to make those 10, etc. If you've got viruses, and each cell that a virus infects is producing 100 individuals, then you, in principle, could be going from 1 individual, 1 virus, to 100 viruses, to 100 times 100 or 10,000 viruses, and so on and so forth. But in terms of bacteria growing in the laboratory, nice and happy in a broth culture, increases at a rate of 2 per generation per doubling time, as we say, is a nice way to represent this. So if you started with 1, so this is 1, a little bit above that 0 right there. After some amount of time, you'd have 2. After the same amount of time, you have 4. After the same amount of time, you have 8. After the same amount of time, you have 16. And then 32. And then 64, and so on and so forth. You can see that the increase that we're going up, each of these steps gets greater and greater and greater. The slope of the curve is becoming steeper and steeper. And of course, this is assuming that the bacteria are not dying in some capacity, which is totally unrealistic with regard to the real world. But when you're growing bacteria in a broth culture, nice and well mixed, you get a pretty good approximation of this exponential increase. So what's going on with the exponential decline? So here, we'll start with, to make it easy, we'll call it 100. I know I'm going to get myself into trouble by doing that, but I'm doing that anyway. And so after some amount of time, we've now gone down to 50. Very convenient that I've sort of set it up so that works. And then after some amount of time, we've gone down to 25. And then after some amount of time, we've gone down to 12.5. And then after some amount of time, we've gone down to 6.25. This is where I'm getting myself into trouble. Of course, is that really the difference between 1 and 6.25 there? Whatever, we're not going to worry about that. Obviously, we're making this up as we go. But that's what an exponential decline is. You have, per unit time, you have a decrease in absolute terms that is decreasing as the number of individuals present are decreasing. So each unit time, where we're, in this case, decreasing by 1/2, but the absolute decrease, that decrease of 1/2, becomes smaller and smaller as the number of individuals present becomes smaller and smaller. So here, the rate increases with time because it's dependent upon how many individuals are present, and the number of individuals keeps increasing. And here the rate decreases in absolute terms because the number of individuals who are dying per unit time declines as the number of individuals that are actually present declines. Now, it doesn't have to be like this. This is a nice linear curve. I mean, it could be like this, where the decline, the rate of decline is absolute, where the number of individuals that die per unit time is really not a function of how many individuals are present. So in this unit here, maybe we've lost 10, and here we've lost another 10, and here we've lost another 10, and here we've lost another 10, and another 10, and so on and so forth until we've gone down to, actually, in this case, 0. And we can do the same thing with the increase. So we could have an increase where after some amount of time we've increased by 10, and then another some amount of time we've increased by 10, and then another amount of time we've increased by 10, and so on and so forth. So we've got 1, and then I guess we have 11, and then 21, and then 31, and then 41, and so on and so forth. But those aren't exponential increases or exponential declines. So these are not what we are talking about when we are considering the potential for disinfectants or various physical things to kill bacteria. And again, not everything kills. Refrigeration, for example, can be a static agent. Over time, you may very well have the organism die, but cold temperatures don't always directly kill things so much as inhibit growth, which is relevant to a chapter that's called The Control of Microbial Growth. I mean, drying things out might also inhibit growth without actually killing organisms. But here we're focusing on sidal effects. And sidal effects typically give you exponential death. So we've drawn all of this craziness, and it's a mess now. So let's turn this to another graph. This time I'll make sure that I say independent variable down here is going to be time. And once again, I'm going to put numbers there. But I'm going to put these numbers up here in such a way that it's different from how we did it over here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is use powers of 10. So I'm going to start down here. Let's see, where should we put it? I'll put it right here. With 10 to the 0, which of course is equal to 1. And so this would be 10 to the minus 1, which would be 0.1. And this would be 10 to the minus 2, which would be 0.01. And then in the other direction, 10 to the 1, which is of course equal to 10. 10 to the 2, which is equal to 100. And 10 to the 3, which is equal to 1,000. So you can see that the increase here, each step it's increasing by tenfold. So here you're going from 10 to the minus 2 to 10 to the minus 1. So this is tenfold bigger than that. That's tenfold bigger than that. That is tenfold bigger than that. That's tenfold bigger than that. Of course, this is what the exponents mean. This is what they're telling us. We have 10 to the 3, it's tenfold bigger than 10 to the 2. Because 10 to the 3 is equal to 10 times 10 times 10. 10 to the 2 is equal to 10 times 10. 10, of course, is equal to 10, or 10 times 1, if you like. Of course, it gets a little tricky down here. This is equal to 1, which is really 10 divided by 10. We'll even write that out. 10 divided by 10. And this is equal to, 0.01 is equal to 10 divided by 10 times 10. And then here we have 10 divided by 10 times 10 times 10. Okay, so that is a different scale from what we have over here. This is an exponential scale. And when you take a curve that looks like this, or a curve that looks like this, so that's exponential death, and that's exponential growth, and you graph it, same numbers, onto something that looks like this, what you end up with for exponential growth is a straight line. And what you end up with for exponential death also is a straight line. So notice that there's no 0 on this graph. I mean, there is a 10 to the 0, but that's not equal to 0, that's equal to 1. In fact, you can go literally forever in that direction, and you would never reach 0. You would get closer and closer and closer and closer to 0. Just like over here, closer and closer and closer and closer to 0, but you would never actually reach 0. So that's the nature of a scale like this. But these are very useful. So in exponential growth, we're starting down here. So we're starting at 10 to the minus 2. At this point, we've got tenfold more. At this point, we have tenfold more. At this point, we have tenfold more. At this point, we have tenfold more, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could, instead of having tenfold increases on the y-axis, we could have twofold increases, in which case we could really map out this exponential increase of bacteria. But usually, what we use in microbiology are powers of 10. So with exponential decline, we're starting at 10 to the 3, so that's 1,000, and then after some unit time, we've got 100 tenfold or have been gotten rid of. After another unit time, we've got another tenfold that have been gotten rid of. But notice that the declines in absolute terms are quite different. So this decline here is minus 900 individuals, whereas this decline here is minus 90 individuals, 100 minus 10. And if we continue down here, this decline going from 10 to the 1 to 10 to the 0 is 9 individuals, so minus 9. And then we go down to here, going from 10 to the 0 to 10 to the minus 1. Here we have a decline of 0.9. That is 1 0.1 subtracted from 1. And then we continue onward, we'll go down to here, I guess. And we've got decline minus of 0.09. So that is 0.1. If you added 0.01 to 0.1, sorry, to 0.09, you would get 0.1. Okay? So you can see that you've got a very consistent decline going on that we can graph in this linear fashion. But this decline, you're killing, in each unit time, you're killing fewer and fewer individuals. And your goal is going to be to kill so many individuals that you're some number below 1. I mean, you don't want it to be just 1/10 of 1, because that still provides you with too high a likelihood that something is still going to be alive. And you don't want to be 1/100th of 1, because you still have a reasonable likelihood. If you're trying to get rid of everything, I mean, you haven't gotten rid of everything necessarily. Let's say roughly in 1 out of every 100 instances, you'd still have an organism alive. So you want to do many, many, many-fold killing. But the actual reason for doing many, many-fold killing, at least in my opinion, is yes, you want to make sure that you've treated for long enough that you have ended up killing things off substantially. But also, not everything is going to be identically susceptible, and not everything is going to be identically reachable by whatever the killing agent that you're using is. So what you're assuring when you do this many, many, many-fold killing is not just that you have high assurances that were everything equally susceptible and equally easily reached by your disinfectant, that you would be killing everything off with some high probability, but also that you have left the disinfectant there for long enough, or whatever the agent that you're using to kill these things off, you've left it there long enough that you have succeeded in not only killing off the most susceptible that you're trying to treat and the most easily reached that you're trying to treat, but in fact that you've killed off even a reasonably large fraction of those individuals that, for whatever reason, are less susceptible. Maybe they're growing slowly, or less easily reached. Maybe they're hiding within cracks, for example, in the thing that you're trying to treat. In fact, that's a good point, that we often find smooth surfaces in laboratories, in microbiology laboratories, and this is because these things are easy to disinfect, because the organisms that are associated with the surface are going to find it very hard to hide on that surface from your disinfectant. And as a consequence, they're all going to be associated with that surface, essentially equivalently reachable. And therefore, your ability to reduce the number of organisms to something approaching 0 is much higher than if you used a very rough, very porous surface. I mean, it would be a nightmare to try to eliminate all of the organisms in an operating room if you had you know, a nice rough surface that everything was being done on, some rough piece of stone, for example. So that's one thing. And before we move on to the next thing, let me make one more point with this graph, and that is that you'll note that the more individuals that you start with, here it's 1,000 or 100 or 10, the longer it's going to take to reduce the number of individuals to some absolute number. So if we're trying to reduce the number of individuals to 1, obviously we usually want to do better than that, but let's say 1, then if we started with 1,000 individuals, it's going to take 3 units of time. Well, let's say that each of those units of time is 10 minutes. Oops. So it would take 30 minutes to reduce this population of target organisms down to 1. But if we started with 100 individuals, it would take instead 1, 2, or 20 minutes. And if we started with 10 individuals, it would take 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. I mean, it works in both directions. If we started with 10 million individuals, obviously it would take much longer to kill everybody off. than if we started with 2 individuals. Of course, the number of individuals starting with are not constrained to being equal in their numbers or their concentrations to powers of 10. But the more individuals that you have present initially, the longer it's going to take to disinfect. And so this is why it can be useful to clean things before you disinfect them. Cleaning has the effect of, if not necessarily killing the organisms, at least removing the organisms, or a way of visualizing it that probably works very well is removing dirt and other things that are soiling whatever it is that you're trying to disinfect, whatever you're trying to remove microorganisms from. So in association with that dirt or soil or whatever are microorganisms. And if we can remove the dirt to a large extent, then we've actually accomplished at least 2 things. The first is that we've likely reduced the number of organisms that we're starting with when we initiate disinfection. But also, we have probably set things up so that the ability of the disinfectant to reach the target organisms is much more similar. So if you have a piece of clothing and it's covered with dirt, I mean, clearly there's going to be places on that clothing and in that dirt that it's harder for the disinfectant to reach than other places. And so if you just get rid of that dirt, you've gotten rid of a lot of the uncertainty about the potential for the disinfectant to reach your target organism. In addition, the dirt, if it's full of organics, might actually interfere with the ability of the disinfectant to act. So starting with fewer organisms, setting it up so that you've got a nice homogeneous surface that is easily reached by whatever it is that you're using to kill off these microorganisms. These are key to setting things up so that, in fact, you have a reasonably high likelihood to be able to get rid of all of the target organisms or targeted organisms over some reasonable length of time. So I had motioned that I wanted to go in this direction, and that's what I'm going to do because I've got room for one more graph. So once again, we have time on the independent axis. And on the dependent axis, although I've done a terrible job of leaving myself room here, instead of having numbers like 10 to the 1 and 10 to the 10, whatever, what I'm going to do instead is use the log. That's log on its side here. The log of the number of organisms. So here we had simply the number of organisms. Here we had the number of organisms as well, but we got funky with how we indicated those numbers. And here we're essentially doing the same thing, except that we're using logs. So these are log base 10. I know that base 10, the 10 of base 10 is an arbitrary number. It's simply a number that we're used to. We've got 10 fingers, and so as a consequence, if we're counting on our fingers, we become very familiar with 10, and so we tend to use base 10. We use base 10 in microbiology. When we say an order of magnitude, we mean a change, in tenfold change. So going from 10 to the 1 to 10 to the 2, 10 to 100, that's an order of magnitude change. Going from 10 to the 1 down to 10 to the 0, that's an order of magnitude change. So we're not using base E, in other words. We're not using ln. We're using log, log, or more explicitly, log base 10, not ln. So I've seen it before, where people who have non-microbiological training feel compelled to use the base E logarithm. But what you end up with if you do that is a graph that, at least to a microbiologist, is extremely unintuitive. A microbiologist wants to see you're going down or you're going up in increments of 10. We say 10 to the 8, and it means something to a microbiologist. If you said e to the 16, it would mean absolutely nothing to a microbiologist. So back to over here. So log, if you take the log of 1,000, log of 1,000, that's equal to 3. It's simply the exponent. If you took log of 100, that'd be equal to 2. If you took log of 10 to the 1, that would be equal to 1. Let me put little arrows here so that it's obvious where these are coming from rather than specifying something on the actual graph. 10 to the 0, 1, the log is 0. So what that means is that log of 1 is equal to 0. It doesn't mean that we have a 0 on this axis. It means that the log is equal to 0, and that's a different thing. Here, log of 10 to the minus 1, log of 0.1 is equal to minus 1. And here, minus 2 is the log base 10. I know I've, in other videos at other times, I've tried to stress this point, but I'm going to stress it again. Understanding exponents and logarithms is really useful. It makes life so much easier. I understand people totally freak out over these things, but when a scientist starts talking about logs and exponents, they're not doing it to confuse people. They're doing it because it is so much easier to understand numbers like these big number changes, many-fold changes, order of magnitude changes if we're using exponents and logarithms. So that's exactly what we're going to do over here. So again, I've left myself no room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the numbers on the inside. So we have 3. I'm trying to correspond to what we have over here. I probably did that backwards, but that's okay. And then minus 1, and then we'll have minus 2 down here. Okay? So now what we've generated is what is known as a log linear graph, or at least the beginnings of one. And all we are going to do in order to generate this graph is to take the numbers that we have on this graph, of course I haven't really drawn it using numbers, but let's say I had, and simply take the log of those numbers. Now you can do that in a calculator, you can do it in a spreadsheet. I suppose once upon a time people could do that sort of thing in their heads, but that's beyond me. But it is easy to do if you've got whole numbers like 1,000, 100, or 10. Then you can simply say, oh, well, 100, that's log of 100 is 2. That's easy. Just count the number of zeros. But if you started with something like 9.37, what's the log of that? We can actually guess what it is. It's going to be something less than 1. Because 9.3, whatever I just said, is pretty darn close to 10, but it's less than 10, and so therefore it's going to, the log of it's going to be less than 1. But in any case, we don't really care. We've got devices these days for doing these calculations for us. Be very thankful we have these devices. Once upon a time, such devices, in fact, did not exist, and people had to calculate logarithms by hand, but we don't have to do that, so we're not going to worry about it. In fact, there is a type of graph paper that you can buy that allows you to, in fact, in a sense, generate one of these log linear graphs, one that's a lot like this, without having to actually calculate the logarithms. And this is very useful if you're living in a world where you can't use all of these computational devices to determine your logs, but we can, so we're not going to really worry about that. Okay, so were we to take this graph and put it over here and use log of number instead of number, then our exponential decline looks like this. Now that should look very familiar, right? Because I drew it so it would be identical to this one, because that's what you'll see. And in fact, your exponential growth will be the same. That little curve down there is unintentional, okay? So if you are, in fact, seeing exponential decline, and you've graphed out what you are working with on log linear graph paper, in other words, if you've graphed the log of the number as a function of time, then you should see, if it's exponential decline that you're seeing, a straight line. Or if it's exponential growth that you're seeing, a straight line. Again, all I've done is I have, hypothetically, taken my numbers and done some kind of log function in a calculator or a spreadsheet or whatever, or if you're really impressive in your head, and taken those numbers and graphed them out, the log of the numbers against time. Time is, in this case, the standard time. It could be minutes, could be hours, whatever. But it's linear. It's going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not log, just those would be, for example, minutes. We get this nice straight curve. Now, if we don't get a straight curve, for example, we might see something like this, where that's supposed to be more or less flat. Where instead of continuing to go downward, you have some plateauing out of the decline. And what that is indicating is that you have organisms that for some reason are resistant. They're either resistant because they're less susceptible to whatever you're treating them with, or the treatment is not as able to actually physically reach them. And so you'll kill the susceptible off at a nice exponential rate, but then you reach a point where you're no longer having exponential death. Alternatively, it's conceivable to have a shoulder where the organisms, I'm going to try to make that flat, where the organisms are displaying some amount of inherent resistance, whatever you're hitting them with, until that level of resistance is overcome, and then you see an exponential decline. So if you've got bacteria and you're treating them with UV radiation, you're actually going to have a shoulder here. Because they can take some amount of UV radiation exposure before they start dying. But once you've overwhelmed them, then you'll see the standard exponential decline. And this has to do with target theory, that basically when you're hitting things with discrete something, that a certain number of hits of that something is going to be necessary to kill them. And you're going to have the number of hits that the bacteria receive Poissonally distributed, so some fraction of them, in fact, is not going to have enough hits so that they actually are killed off. And that's why you don't suddenly see the organism instantaneously being gotten rid of. It takes time, and that time represents the probabilistic nature of treatments. Treatments, even if their chemicals are discrete, it's individual chemicals, the organism has to be exposed to a certain amount of them for a certain amount of time to mess up its physiology enough so that, in fact, the organism dies. So over here, we can also draw another curve, making a dash of it so it's easier to see. So that curve you'll see is less shallow than this curve. And so what's going on here? Well, one possibility is that we're using the same treatment, but we're using it to a lesser extent. So it could be a disinfectant, and we're using it at half strength. And that here has the effect of simply killing off the organisms with exponential death, but the rate of killing is lower. Either that, or maybe we have doubled the amount of disinfectant, for example. Now, there are potentially problems with doubling the amount of disinfectant. It might not work as well as you expect it will work, or by using that much chemical, it might be damaging to whatever it is that you're treating, more so than if you use less chemical. But let's say we used twice as much, and now we're seeing a steeper rate of decrease. So this is still an exponential decline, but it's a steeper one. And that simply means that per unit time, we're killing off organisms more rapidly. Also over here, if we started with this concentration of whatever it is we're treating with, and we started with 10 to the 2 individuals, I mean, I'm trying to draw those two lines parallel, you can see this idea that if you started with a greater number of individuals, it's simply going to take you longer until you've reached some level of killing of the population than if you started with fewer individuals. So you're seeing the same rate of decrease, but it's an exponential rate of decrease. So just like over here, we killed off that population. Again, we using whatever concentration of the killing agent that we used in here for the treatment of that population. We're getting simply a rate of killing on an exponential scale that's identical. It's just that we're starting at a lower level, so we're going to reach a lower level faster, or some lower level faster. And if you drew these here, over here, we would see curves that look more like this. So it's a slower rate of killing versus this. I suppose I should draw that with dashes. Or alternatively, if we started down here, we would see something that pretty much is parallel to what's above it. That's harder for me to draw, which is representing, comparing that curve with that curve. Okay? So what we're talking about is control of microbial growth. General principle is that when we are controlling microbes and we're trying to kill them off, we're typically able to reduce their numbers in a way that is exponential. An exponential death is observed. The steeper the curve, the faster the organisms are being killed off. The fewer organisms you start with, then the sooner you're going to reach some certain lower level of organisms because you're simply starting with fewer, even if the rate at which you're killing exponentially is the same. And also, if you should happen to have organisms that for whatever reason are more resistant than other organisms in the community or population that you're treating, then you're going to have some kind of leveling off in your killing. You're going to have at best a biphasic curve where one set of organisms is more susceptible and it's killed off rapidly, and then another set of organisms is less susceptible or not susceptible at all, and it's killed off less rapidly. So the curves, there's actually two curves being represented here. Lower rate of killing off and higher rate of killing off. And you're not seeing the lower rate of killing off because you're not distinguishing among the different types of organisms. And so until you've killed off the more susceptible ones, you're not going to be able to even see in a curve like this the rate at which you're killing off the less susceptible ones, unless you're able to, in fact, distinguish between these two. So that's all I think I wanted to talk about in terms of exponential death. Again, the chapter is the control of microbial growth. This is, I guess, the general principles of control of microbial growth.